more, and we want to use all of this to work towards self-reliance. It should be easy, right? Why can't we just take what we have used for 500 youth and just apply it to 20 million? That's what scaling is all about, right? Not so fast, says Larry Cooley, our next speaker. He's the founder of MSI and now Tetra Tech. And for more than 4 decades, Larry has been a thought leader, author, and lecturer on a wide range of development management issues, including scaling. And he currently directs a global community of practice on scaling innovation. So Larry will give a short presentation, and then we will have 2 lightning talks by programs that have scaled youth programs. So Larry, Angela, and Yewa, thank you.
Thank you for letting an ex-youth join you this afternoon. I wanted to say just a little bit by way of introducing this. The reason I've gotten so compulsive about this issue of scaling is if you do a survey, as I did, of projects to scale, the average batting average is about 5%. That would mean of all the lightning talks that were given today, 1 might scale. Well, that's simply an insufficient and inadequate and unacceptable batting percentage, and I'm really persuaded that it's possible to do better. And what I want to try to share with you in the next few minutes is a framework for thinking about this. Then we'll give you a couple of examples, and then we'll take some questions and discussion. Okay. So start here. Big problems, or any problem, has a denominator. The denominator is the size of the problem. So now imagine what's the problem. Well, maybe the problem is the youth bulge in a country, or the problem is the returning emigres to El Salvador, or the problem is the kids who are somehow disrupted now in their learning styles and job options in Nicaragua, or the problem is that whoever the target group is that's targeted by the surfing program. That problem has a size. Now take what we're doing in whatever our programs may be. That's the numerator. And in most of our programs, we're pretty good about talking about the numerator, and we're pretty quiet about the denominator, because there's a piece of us that knows that the prospects of going from the numerator to anything close to the denominators, not very high. So when you're thinking about scaling, I want you to not let yourself, as hard as this is, not let yourself stop with the numerator. Challenge yourself with the denominator. And here's something I'll tell you that's a little disquieting, which is that big problems usually require big solutions. Big solution usually means a lot bigger than the resources that you and I have access to on a daily basis. So it means you need some pretty clever form of leverage, some trick of the trade to try and move from a modest-sized solution, from this little guy, to flip the big guy who's staring him down. And I'll give you a few more pieces of this that challenge it even a bit more. One is that very, very few, in my experience, of the projects are anywhere near the size they would need to be if they were going to tackle the problem they're dealing with in brute force. And to make that even slightly worse, over the last decade, the number of development donors, official donors, has doubled. The number of projects has doubled. The average size of project has cut about in half. The average duration is cut about in half. Those are exactly in the wrong direction if you were trying to match the solution to the problem. I'll give you another piece of this. It's now pretty widely accepted, and I would certainly argue, that very few pro-poor social innovations scale spontaneously. Scaling is an active act. And so the idea that we're going to somehow develop a prototype, the world's going to learn from our brilliant example, and then it's going to spontaneously replicate that solution. I won't say it's never happened, but it almost never happens. So to rely on that is usually not a solution to the issue of scaling. So that makes it, to me, particularly troubling that very few of the projects that you look at have been analyzed in advance or designed with scale specifically in mind. They act as if we could do it on a small scale, there would be some kind of fairy dust that would take it to large scale without nearly the level of attention to how that happens that they would put into designing the innovation in the first place. And maybe even more damning, very few of the projects, particularly the ones that call themselves pilot or demonstration or proof of concept or prototype, very few of them do the things that, in my opinion, they would need to do if they were serious about scale. So how could one begin to think better about this? The first thing is you've got to rid yourself of this model, that the reward for a good project is another project. That's the world most of us live in. It's the way most of us are funded, but it's not the way large-scale change happens. Development is not a bunch of projects lined up end to end. A different way to think about it is that a project is a short-term intervention that's trying to change a long-term process or outcome. So in other words, there was a world before the project. There's going to be a world after the project. The project is the intervention. And its objective is to somehow make the world after different than it would have been otherwise, and certainly different than it was before. So we're trying to jar the system in a direction it was not taking itself by virtue of this project. That's a very heavy lift. That's different than just delivering a benefit to a person. So struggling with this problem, which I have been for the last 15 years, some colleagues of mine at MSI, and I've been really obsessed with this problem for about a decade and a half now, we finally settled on a way of thinking about it that's set up as a 3-step, 10-task process. It says, look, if you were serious about development, the first step, which includes 4 tasks, has to do with how you plan with scale in mind. And I'm going to talk a little more about that than about the other 2 steps today. The second step is how do you do what I would call the political tasks of getting the commitments from governments, from markets, from others that would make it possible to take things to scale. We usually don't think of that as what we as development implementers do. I want to argue to you, if you don't do that, you probably don't scale. So step 2 has to do with 3 more tasks that deal with those political functions. Step 3 has to do with the operational tasks, the actual process of taking things to scale. For those of you who are interested, I'm happy to talk more about this, but I'm not going to dig down into those tasks this afternoon. The first piece of it is trying to figure out as clearly and as cogently as you can what it is that you're trying to scale. And if you're following what I was saying before, what you're not trying to scale is the project. The idea is we have a project and we want to make a bigger project. The thing we're trying to scale is something that the project is helping to advance, an idea, a model, approach, a set of interventions, a way of doing things. Neither are we trying to scale usually just the technical side. If you looked at the single greatest flaw, I think, now in the way innovation is being supported, it's by people who are so preoccupied with the technology or with the model development that they don't worry about all the other things in the system that would need to change for that to come to scale. And I can promise you if you do that, the ones that will scale will not necessarily be the best ones. They'll be the ones who attend to those systemic factors best. So, for example, I spent a couple of years working with a program some of you may know called Communities in Schools. It's the largest dropout prevention program in the U.S. It's a wonderful program. Early on, it had about 15,000 kids it was helping. It's now 1.5 million kids. So that means it's grown 100-fold. There are, to their reckoning, about 15 million kids who would benefit from the program that they're delivering. That means it would take another 10-fold increase over where they are. That's the denominator. Going from 15,000 to 1.5 million involved a complete change, not in what they were trying to deliver, but how they were trying to deliver it. And trying to go from 1.5 million to 15 million is going to take an equally compelling change in what they do, how they work with teachers' unions, how they work with school boards, how they finance the model, how they decentralize, how they set up internal quality controls. All that has to change. Now, you may say that's not the intervention. I say it is the intervention. That's exactly the thing we're trying to do to get to scale. Anything that's a project inside that is something trying to help us in some way to make that happen. So if you take this just one step further, there are really only 2 structures, only 2 platforms that are able to deliver outcomes at scale. trust me for a minute on this, so you can challenge if you like afterwards. There are governments and there are markets. Those are the only systems on the planet that have an ability to deliver outcomes at scale and sustainably. There's a small exception to that. Once in a while, philanthropy, and in this case, I'm including development assistance as philanthropy. There are a few cases where that happens. If I was giving you one, I would give you one like Alcoholics Anonymous. If I were giving you a second one, it would be things that are faith-based, like parochial schools. But there are very, very, very few non-market-based or government-based things that go to scale. So that means if you've got a scaling strategy, what that means is you have a strategy for getting markets and or governments to do something different. If you don't have a scaling strategy. Talk just a little bit about who does the scaling. So there are lots of different ways you could think about this, but I want to suggest one, which is that one model of scaling says the organization that develops a new model, like most of you, itself grows. So if the problem is 1,000 times larger than you, the way you serve it is by getting 1,000 times larger yourself. That's expansion. That would be the McDonald's model. Everybody needs a hamburger, let's have a lot more hamburger stands. The second possibility is what I'm calling replication. Replication says that you develop something with the hope that somebody else is going to take it to scale. Well, that's a completely different management and development pathway. That means your job is what does it take to convince them to make the change? How much do you have to know about their system, not just about your innovation, about their system to make that happen? What's the process of trying to move that from you to them? The third possibility, the ones I'm calling collaboration here, have to do with you continuing to be part of the equation, but not entirely. So for example, somebody else does the financing, you do the quality control. Somebody else does the advocacy, you do the monitoring and evaluation. So that there's some division of labor around something that was originally started as a one organizational enterprise. In the youth programming areas, which I'm not an expert in, but which I've spent a lot of time looking at for the last few years, in the youth program areas, it's almost never expansion. It's almost always either replication or collaboration, and so the management models are either how do you bring people in to this thing, or how do you make yourself useful to them. Here's one more piece I want to layer into this, which is that think about the wheel on the left and the wheel on the right. The wheel on the left is the innovation wheel. It's basically generating new ideas. It's the business most of you are in. The wheel on the right is delivering things at scale. That's mostly governments and markets. For the most part, that's the business you're not in. But it's the only device that's going to be able to deliver the things you're doing at scale. So you could say, fine, why does it have to stick another wheel in the middle between those two? I can tell you that without exception, this is one of the few totally flat-footed statements I'm going to make, but without exception, when scaling happens successfully, somebody is performing those intermediation functions. And it's usually not the innovator, and it's usually not the large system deliverer. These functions are things like this. They're things like beginning to package things for scale, the systems change stuff that needs to happen. And this is, in my personal opinion, this is the missing link. This is the broken part of the business cycle in taking things to scale. We're doing fine at innovating. Listen to yourselves today. Listen to all the great ideas that are in this room. And of course, we're delivering services to people, for better or for worse. But we're doing a terrible job of translating the good ideas into those service delivery platforms. That's the place the system is breaking down. And if I could, for those of you who are donors, if I could pitch an issue to donors, it would be focused there more than on the innovation side. I'm not going to go into this in any length, but another piece of this is an ability to try and assess an intervention for its potential to reach scale. And there we've developed, various people have done this in different ways. MSI happens to have a 32-item scalability checklist. It's broken down into these categories that allow people to kind of assess where the likely challenges are going to be in taking a particular intervention to scale. And there's implications of all of this for what when we talk about pilot projects, and you might think I'm against them based on what I've said, I'm not. I'm a big fan of pilot projects, but I think they have a lot of work to do. And pilot projects does not just mean doing it small so that somebody can later do it big. It means doing all the things you would need to do on a small scale that will help make it happen on a big scale. So that means generating the evidence that people need. It means involving the persons and the organizations that would be necessary. You can complete the rest of that conversation yourselves. All right, so let me very quickly go through 5 design guidelines. So if you're designing with scale in mind, here are 5 things I would have you keep in mind. The first thing is look beyond the glitter on this. By that I mean the point I was making before about the preoccupation with the innovation and the insufficient attention to how to bring the innovation to scale. The second thing is you have to think scale early. A lot of you may have seen or heard an articulation of this. I myself used it for a long time that says it's a 3-wave phenomenon. It starts with working on effectiveness, then efficiency, then expansion. I'm now pretty sure that's wrong. And the reason I say that is the people who wait till later to worry about efficiency and expansion, by the time they get there, the pilot or the demonstration or the small project that they are so desperately in love with has got elements baked in that are extremely difficult to scale. So unless you're focusing on what it would take to scale it, even before you know if it's worthy of being scaled, in other words, you got to plan for scale before you know if you should be going to scale, you'll find yourself on the wrong side of a bridge that's difficult to traverse. Third thing, to try to get things to scale worthiness, it's usually a game of subtraction. You're usually trying to take things out, not put things in. So you're saying, what could we do without? If we pulled something out that reduces the complexity by 30% and it reduces the effectiveness by 10%, that was a good deal. Fourth, scalability and sustainability. These are, to me, now not identical twins exactly, but conjoined twins. And in that sense, it means that you should never think about one without thinking about the other. So every time somebody says it's sustainable, you should answer, yes, but at what scale? And every time they say it's scalable, you should say, yes, but is it sustainable? And finally, I can tell you that the pathway, and I've now looked and helped on a lot of scaling activities, the pathway is never straight. So people who think you could do a kind of an advanced detailed log frame or action plan for this, it simply doesn't work that way. I'm one of the developers of the log frame, and I'm telling you that. It doesn't work that way. It has to be able to take several bends as it learns along the way. So building the adaptation into the instrument that you use to fund these things and to implement these things becomes essential. Absent that, you end up all dressed up and no place to go. And that process, again, it's hard to generalize, but I will, takes about 15 years. So if you look at across a wide range of sectors and interventions to get to scale with a good idea, doing everything right is typically about a 15-year journey. So you need to, since that in our world of projects means a bunch of project cycles, you need to figure out how each one helps to propel the next and has meaningful outcomes in its own right. So you'll all be familiar with this, Mike perhaps more than most. This is a framework for positive youth development. And I want to just reflect on that very, very, very briefly from a scaling perspective. So if I were pointing out 3 things about that, and I heard a couple of you in the last session to make similar points, it's got lots of pieces. There are lots of dimensions to this. Well, you're hearing me argue for simplicity. Here's an obviously complicated set of interventions. It requires collaboration. I can't think of any way to do that without collaborating. Collaboration is definitely one of the pathways, but it's not the easiest. It's a hard one. And finally, this model, your model, which I absolutely think is well designed and well thought through, takes youth empowerment not just as one of the intermediate outcomes. It's an end in its own right. I mean, it's an important piece of this puzzle. So the process is not simply a neutral factor. It's a major piece of what you're doing. Those things tend to be harder to scale. So where would I start on this? Well, this is a little presumptuous, but this is, I'll start this conversation. I think, first of all, as a community, our ability to conceptualize complexity is greater than our ability to manage complexity. So I have more confidence in our ability to think our way through the problem than to manage our way through the problem. So where do you go with that? You have to hope, in my opinion, that there are opportunities to have virtuous cycles. You find an entry point and you can use it to branch out to other areas rather than waiting for everything to be in place before you move. And if I were picking an analogy for that, or a kind of a memory of mine on that, it would be the integrated rural development conversation, or possibly the resilience conversation, which are similarly complicated and multifaceted, but if you waited for everything to be lined up before you moved, you would never move. So you have to use the access points you have to try and leverage as much of the rest of it as is possible. To me, in this case, scaling, therefore, sometimes means broadening the range of interventions with the same population, not just taking the same intervention to larger populations. And finally, I would say that in this area, as in many, but especially in this kind of area, context is king. The idea that you can simply take a solution from place X and plop it into place Y is a pipe dream. So a big part of the tailoring and the adaptation process is central to this conversation. So that's it for me. But what I want to do now is to ask my colleagues here, Angie, Martin, Matthew, I was close. And thank you. And Yawub, to talk about a couple of what I think are very interesting projects from exactly this point of view. What we'll do after that is we'll invite you all to have a little bit of conversation, either in the form of questions to them and me if you want, or in the form of comments and observations about your own programs and some of the challenges to scaling. Thanks a lot.
Hello, everyone. I'm Angie Venza. I'm the Regional Director for the Americas at the International Youth Foundation. I'm here with my colleague Matthew Bremen, who is the Regional Director for Africa at IYF. And we're here to tell you a little bit about some programming we've done that has tried to take to scale some initiatives to sort of insert innovations into TVET systems around the world. In many countries, technical and vocational education does not equip young people with the skills needed to secure and retain quality employment. And employers find that young people coming out of these systems do not always have the skills, both technical skills and soft skills, that they need. And so IYF has worked in a number of countries to try to facilitate changes in TVET systems that improve the relevancy and the quality of skills that young people receive, and including the pedagogy with which they are delivered. These interventions were designed from the beginning to reach scale, as Larry referred to, and that was critical to their success. And we did that by embedding approaches in institutions so that they continue on beyond the intervention, and also by then taking those across institutions within an education system. So we're going to tell you about two examples. I'm going to talk about Mexico, and Matthew's going to tell you about a project in South Africa. So with USAID funding, IYF implemented a program in Mexico called Rutas, which was from the beginning intended to integrate a variety of approaches to improve services at TVET systems in Mexico, including hard skills and soft skill training, career guidance, and job placement support. All of those components are important and critical to have together and mutually support each other. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about how we worked to scale the sort of revised technical training in a way that was really market relevant in the schools. So the first thing we did was we spent really like the first year or two even really mapping out the landscape and understanding the systems deeply, and that meant both the labor market system and what it needed, as well as the schools themselves, as the TVET system itself, and understanding where the gaps were in skills, but also where were the barriers inherent in the school system that hindered their ability to really deliver training that matched the market. And so that took a huge amount of effort and really deep understanding of what was going on in these systems, what were the incentives that were baked in, what were the politics, et cetera. We strategically selected one system called CONALEP because they had the most autonomy to make curricular changes, and so that was the sort of easiest way to look at testing and adoption approach. We then, part of what was critical was establishing ourselves as a credible broker, the intermediary role that Larry referred to, really setting ourselves up as a bridging role between the industry as well as and the education authorities. And it took a while to build that credibility, and we had to prove that we really understood the needs of both systems and how they worked in order to have that, play that credible role. So we made sure that we knew where industry was struggling to find the key skills, and then we convinced them that we could help them redesign curriculum that would meet their needs. Knowing that, we were also able to get the schools to be more open to curricular changes, because we were saying, you know, we're bringing along employers who were ready to hire the students if you can make the curricular changes. We worked with schools and systems to identify where the skills were or were not in their curricula, and we helped really facilitate the curriculum revisions. And that had to be done in a way that deeply understood how that school's technical training worked, and made sure that we designed the curriculum in a way that slid into their systems in as least disruptive way as possible. So what did we achieve? We ended up totally, with ROOTS and other programs that followed it, revising 14 curricula for industries as diverse as aerospace, IT, hospitality, and integrated them into over 100 schools in 8 states in Mexico. We trained probably nearly 1,000 teachers, reached 100,000 young people. But what was more important is that these changes were embedded now in the institution. So those teachers were going to continue to use their new skills and abilities to train more students going forward. So I'll leave it there so Matthew can tell you about South Africa, and then we can talk more at the conversation, the Q&A.
Thanks, Angie. I'm going to try and be brief. 2013, we started working with TVETs in South Africa. Fast forward 2015, where really the scaling thinking and work began with, in partnership with Irish Aid. We conducted a youth assessment in the manufacturing industry. And the findings from that will be no surprise to many here. Employers found this gap in life skills and work readiness skills. We were working at the time with the Department of Higher Education and Training, and that relationship was critical because we had to identify what were the easy pathways to start integrating the life skills into the national system. And there were 2 that we did a pilot, operations research, 2-year pilot that sort of came down to 2. One was what they call a life orientation course, which is a prerequisite for all the technical TVET courses. And then the other is what we call career guidance, which they call student support service offices. So working through these counselors and integrating what we have the digitized life skills curriculum. So right there we had already sort of an entry point that was baked into how we could get to scale. This is a 750,000 young people go through annually are in the national system. I can talk a bit more through the question and answer period about all of that. The fortunate part here is to have a donor, Irish Aid in this case. We also had some support from Caterpillar Foundation, residual leftover funding from a prior program. But the capacity and the ability of the partner, the donor, to understand the complexities and the time it takes to get to scale was really critical. We're working right now in 5 of the 50 public TVET systems, or colleges rather, in the country. We're working, as I mentioned, with DHET on life skills enhancement to the system-wide curricula, and that is the platform for scale. The biggest challenge, Larry mentioned it, Angie as well, gaining trust within the national TVET system, the credibility that Larry mentioned. First from the national government, then from the individual TVET colleges, the teachers, the young people themselves. That's key. So I'm just going to conclude with sort of 4, I think, key lessons about sort of what worked for us, and it translates to what you heard earlier. One is building strong relationships at all levels of the system. So with the key stakeholders I just mentioned, national, local, teachers, students. Identifying who in the system, employers, educators, are most incentivized to better prepare young people for work, and you tap into that motivation. Number two is demonstrate to stakeholders that you understand the system. And for us, what is critical in this piece is having your local staff, so people from the country leading this initiative with the national system. So our staff have worked with and within that national TVET systems. That, I think, is fundamental. The external expat model will not work. It hasn't worked for us. Third is be flexible and agile so you can adapt the solution to the local context. We talked about a lot of this, ignoring the operational realities and constraints of the system at your peril. We started with 5 TVET colleges at the very beginning in 2015. Then we were down to 3, and in the end we actually had 1 that we ended up working with. It ended up working out, and we were able to sort of build a case from there. And the last point I'll make is make sure you build in time and space to plan, execute, fail fast, learn, course correct, and you're doing all of that in partnership with all the stakeholders, the markets, the government, young people, civil society organizations. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt.
That's fine. Okay. All right. So I wanted to share an interesting approach that's being scaled up organically on the MasterCard Foundation-funded YETA program in northern Uganda. So it turns out that youth are so excited about working within their groups that they're actually forming their own cooperative businesses. So the NCVA Clusa approach facilitates self-directed change within these youth associations, and they're doing this by prioritizing skills building and agency. And this is what the PYD framework has shown to be quite essential. On my slide, I had a map of Uganda, but yeah, not here. But it's so the districts we work in are Masindi, Kole, Kiriandongo, and Dokolo in northern Uganda. And like I said, the program is implemented by NCVA Clusa, and it is in partnership with the MasterCard Foundation, and our partners are Making Sense, Youth Alive Uganda, and Reproductive Health Uganda. So some of our youth associations have been inspired to become member-led, self-governed cooperative businesses, and they're actually doing it with their own money, which is pretty cool. We found that mentorship, skills building, and working in supportive groups were really critical for that evolution to take place. So we asked youth why they wanted to continue working in groups, and they basically said, you know, they enjoyed working in groups because they were able to share knowledge with each other, they were able to learn, and it just provided a sense of belonging for them. And that's actually what makes the cooperative business model attractive to youth as well. So cooperatives provide an environment for success that couples self-reliance and independence with collaboration and support. So youth really like that flexibility. And there are 3 fundamental principles of cooperative businesses. So they're member-owned, they're member-controlled, and they provide their members with meaningful benefits. So I wanted to just let you guys know that cooperatives weren't really a part of our original program mandate. It wasn't anything we originally had in our indicators. But nevertheless, 2 primary co-ops were developed, and they've completed their registration process and are now currently operational. And then another 21 will complete their registration process by February of 2019. And so these primary co-ops are made up of smaller youth groups, and they represent hundreds of youth. So membership is open and inclusive. So youth that are not a part of the YETA program are also able to join. So if I had my slide here, you would see that I was showing the PYD framework. And so our interventions really closely align with the PYD framework. So we've talked about how YEDA incorporates assets and contribution and agencies through skills building and that cooperative business model. But the enabling environment is also critical to successful scaling up. And so those groups really provide a safe, supportive environment for youth to explore opportunities. And those youth associations are inclusive regardless of gender, economic stability, or whether or not they have a disability. So we really think that co-ops can lead to scale. So YEDA is developing lasting connections between youth associations and their communities. Local adult mentors with experience in cooperatives are providing information, guidance, and technical know-how to interested youth. And through peer-to-peer mentorship, as well as some exchange visits that the YEDA program is brokering, the motivation to graduate from associations to a cooperative is spreading to other districts, which is really exciting to see. So we also think that this business model is sustainable. So the cooperative structure from association to pre-co-op to cooperative provides youth with the motivation, resources, skills, and connections they need to develop strong democratic businesses, and youth really own that process. So thank you.
Thank you. Maria, how long do we have? How long do we have? 17 minutes. Okay. So let's do this. Just take 2-3 minutes and talk to the person adjacent to you. Either to focus on either something that struck as a responsive chord in you, a question you might have, or a constraint you may be running into. Then we'll take as many of those in kind of a lightning way as we can, either as comments or as questions. If they're questions, we'll try our best to respond. So 2 or 3 minutes, then we'll go back into plenary. Okay, everybody. Okay, so anything is fair game. It can be a question, it can be a comment, or what? Yes, sir.
Thank you. Larry, great presentation. Question is, a lot of us work with civil society, right? A lot of service providers, private sector, nonprofit involved in technical training and TVET, for instance. So if the only ones that can scale are government and markets, are we doing the wrong thing? And along with that is that if we're in a project, and might there be a way to determine at an early stage that we're not going to be able to get government or market involved in scaling, should we stop the project? And connected to that, of course, is what role can the donor community have in influencing government policy so that they'll be open to scaling?
I'm going to give an answer you might think is peculiar, but my answer is it depends on who's funding you. The reason I say that is I think I'm doing a lot of work these days with foundations. And when foundations or philanthropic money in general is funding something, it can excuse itself from the issue of scale if it wants to. In other words, it can say we just help whoever we help. We're giving ourselves permission to ignore the denominator. But if you buy into that game, the denominator game, and you're working in civil society, you're playing a very hard hand. A very hard hand. And so I would say if you both are civil society and you're working with civil society, you have to be scheming all the time to try and figure out a crosswalk to either the corporate or to the government sector, unless you're one of those very, very rare exceptions that can achieve scale through those mechanisms alone. I'm sorry, I know that's a hard answer, but I think that's the truthful answer. It's not an okay. So wait. So I'll give you the slightly more uplifting version, which is equally true, which is that governments are very disinclined to change on their own accord. And so unless there's something strong going on in civil society, corporations have a big incentive to change on their own accord. Governments, the incentives tend to work the other way, and inertia is usually your biggest enemy. And so if you're civil society and your target is government, I say God bless you, because if they were left to simply be their own motivators in this, the chances of change would be severely diminished. Others, comments, questions? Mike?
So again, great presentation. We had Larry actually present this to the youth technical experts at USAID as well to have us think about. So when we think about earlier in the day the journey to self-reliance, and we take a country that may be low on the self-reliance roadmap, let's take Liberia.
Yeah.
Not a lot of money in the coffers, low on the capacity to implement and commitment to certain areas. How do we look, very limited private sector, very limited government capacity. So how do we take this journey to scale in low self-reliance environment?
This is going to. I hope this doesn't sound glib, but this is what I think. I think you have to start with them, not with us. By that I mean looking at what's really, from their own point of view and in their own system of ability to finance development, what's not happening that could potentially, that's not like be a foot taller, but it's really something that they could do and aren't quite, where either an intervention or a little bit of discretionary finance or a piece of counsel that they didn't have, or maybe sometimes just the ability to blame it on somebody else, makes it possible to try some things or to adopt some things that they wouldn't. But I think the model that totally doesn't work in resource-deprived areas is coming in with interventions, however good they are, and then hoping to see them scale afterwards, because those countries, I mean, put yourself in their position, as I know you've been many times, put yourself in that position. They're resource deprived. If you come with money, they're going to take it. If it's a program, they're going to take it. But the chances that they can then line up behind it and really do that at the scale that they would need to in order to carry it through, they can pick one or two or three things to do that with. That's it. And so if you're not investing the time and energy to make sure that you're one of those one or two or three priorities, they'll probably let your project go. It may even be a good project in the sense of its immediate deliverables, but the chances of that being picked up by the system, I would say, are small to none. Others?
Yeah. Hi, Shelby
French
Where are
from
you?
Child
There you
Fund International. Yeah, just my question kind of tags onto that about scalability and populations on the move. So mobile populations, where, they're sliding past government and markets. Is there any hope for scalability with that population? And then the other aspect, you mentioned that focus on technology, and you got to get beyond that, but technology in and of itself, does that stand as another way to replicate alongside the private sector and government, or do you put technology in one of those two categories?
Yeah. So those are both really good questions. In my opinion, the development conversation is now zeroing in on fragile states, and also, but less obviously, on mobile populations. And clearly, that's the last frontier for the kind of things that we do. A colleague of mine, Jonathan Papalidis from World Vision, and I just wrote this paper on scaling up in fragile states. And one of the things that we came to believe, I don't know if you'll agree with me or not, but that there's a real chance to use a scaling framework in those places to tackle 2 or 3 things simultaneously. One is whatever the immediate need is, but another one is the usual lack of social capital. And in particular, if you look at the literature about social capital, the tack on it that I like the best is the one that looks at bonding, bridging, and linking social capital. And in those places, the linking stuff is a mess, and the bridging stuff is a mess. The bonding stuff sometimes is very tight, namely the communities that are on the move have to somehow bond with themselves, but they're very badly linked to everybody else into the larger system. So to try to use the scaling as a way to enter into that really hugely difficult setting, I think is really promising, and that includes mobile populations, not limited to them, but it includes them. The technology thing, this is one of the few times I really wish I was born later than I was. I mean, I really only kind of am beginning to understand it. I really think it has the potential to change a lot of the things I've said. For example, that 15-year figure that I gave you, I think there's situations in which technology can dramatically accelerate that. But I also think it's very seductive, and that it's just a little too tempting to default to a technology answer around something that I think has got tentacles into all kinds of other problems. So I think the technology piece of this is underexplored, and there's a lot more work to be done there. I'm realizing that I'm not turning my eyes left on this, and I would like to, on any of the things that people have said so far, any of you want to relate that back to the projects you were talking about? Don't feel obliged, but feel invited.
Yeah. No, I'll just mention something about the question related to how do you work in perhaps low self-reliance sort of environments. And I think, but what I'm going to say really applies to any of them. I think the critical piece is to make sure that whatever you're bringing to the table is actually uniquely adapted to their context. And so it's not about, we're going to come in and we're going to pay to do something now and expect them to continue it later. It's really understanding what is that context, where there already perhaps resource sort of flows. And for example, in Mexico, it was, teachers were already teaching this stuff. We just got, we went in and helped train the teachers to do it better, but it was already built in so that it could continue on with the existing funding flows. We weren't asking them to add more funds in. And I think going in with that perspective and not think that I'm bringing the answer, but rather looking at really where the gaps and where the incentives for those, whoever that local system you're trying to influence, where the incentives are for them to improve what they're doing and create something uniquely for that context. And I think that's actually the best way to approach any situation.
If I were encouraging you to, on one point that I think kind of flips your attitude on this, it would be my first slide about denominators. So whatever it is you're working on, just ask yourself who you would aspire to have it, who would be benefited by this, what would be the putative target group on this, and then it sets you down the road. It's frustrating sometimes, but at least sets you down the road of thinking, what would it take to get anywhere near that number, to even get the right number of zeros to get toward that number. And you usually back yourself up to some strategy for using the project to affect something else, not just using the project to deliver benefits to some group of people. I'll give you just one other kind of tidbit on this. I mentioned in passing that years ago I was involved in developing the log frame. For those of you who've worked or suffered with it, I can tell you that the two top levels, purpose and goal, when we developed it, had one concept, which was that up to the purpose level, it was the project. The purpose to goal was the link of the project to the larger system. But there's a different kind of logic, equally logical, that says up to the purpose is the organizational or behavioral change, and the goal is the impact on those individuals of making that change. That's just as logical. It's just as much a hierarchy of objectives, but it never connects back to the larger system. So when most of the projects, and I can say this now with some confidence, across donor agencies, took the second use of project and made the projects more self-contained. So the project had impact, but the impact was on the people who were served by the project, not on the larger system. It basically took project and moved them out of the system. That gives all of us the obligation of figuring out how to move them back in again. So I think another way of having exactly the conversation we're having, is how do you use projects as instruments? When the project isn't the system, the project is your effort to influence it. Melanie, last one.
So yes, assuming we are working within the, assuming we are working within the government system, from a youth perspective, we are very much confronted about whom within the government system to work, between Ministry of Youth, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Gender, Social Inclusion, and so on and so forth. And sometimes we are reduced to pick the champion that can carry and feel that they are ready to actually go through the journey of scaling and understanding really how to work within their system. Any example where, by any chance, different ministries have really joined forces together along for the scaling up pathway?
Well, I only know, my range isn't that wide on it, but I'll tell you a couple that I'm personally involved with. One is early childhood development in South Africa, which exactly cuts across that range of things. And the other is I'm working with Sesame Street and IRC, something called Sesame Seeds, which is working with the Syrian refugee kids. And again, it cuts across all of these sorts of things. Now, to me, it's obviously another complicating factor, but it's also a real asset in that if you're trying to mobilize, you've got a lot of opportunities. So I would say, to take a kind of a bad analogy, it's a target-rich environment in the sense that if this door doesn't open, you've got that one. And one of the things that happened in South Africa, just as an example, is the early childhood development work really caught its feet when the health ministry also got interested. That was not their original focus, but it was definitely part of the equation. So it congruent, at least, with the notion I had before, that when you've got something as complicated as this, you could see it as a huge complicating factor, or you could say there are lots of roads in. All right, I think this is time for us to end. I will do that both by thanking the panelists and also by telling you that Melanie and I are going to try to carry on at least a little bit of this conversation about scaling at one of the roundtables afterwards. And for any of you who are interested in this community of practice I described before on scaling, is just about to establish a working group on youth programs, and I'll keep you posted. Thank you all very much.